So welcome everyone. We're having our our last conversation of mine for the day for the event. So I think we're finishing on a high here. Throughout the conference, of course, we've been talking about a new reality, and when we consider what is happening within our cities, I'm really pleased to be able to bring a couple of people to join us here in the conversation. We're having a little bit of fun here, of course, Brenna. But Brenna Berman, who's the CEO and Executive Director of City Tech Collaborative, but with a history, and we'll get into that in a second. And also Kirk Mitchell, who is our SVP and General Manager for the Americas. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Brenna,
Yes.
alluded a little bit to, you've got a past. That past is engaged in cities and the city of Chicago, where in fact you, of course, served as the Chief Information Officer for the City and Commissioner in the Department of Innovation and Technology.
Yes.
Talk to me about one of probably the most misunderstood elements of a city, the curb. Help us understand, what is a curb? Why should we care?
I mean, you should care about the curb because it's probably the most underappreciated and underloved aspect of real estate in the city. And there's a lot of talk about it today because of some of the things we'll talk about. There's a lot of interest in the curb now. But city governments have been interested in the curb for hundreds of years, right? It was actually invented, if it could have been invented, in Amsterdam more than 200 years ago. And the curb is any structure in the street, between the buildings on the edge, that helps divide up the traffic in the street. That's all the curb is, right? In the US, we're used to curbs that are like a little lip. And sometimes they're half an inch, and sometimes, depending on your height, they're really hard to step down. In other parts of the world, the curb is just a painted stripe on the street. If you are familiar with Amsterdam, the curb is actually a pole that comes up out of the street to separate automobile traffic from pedestrian traffic, from bike traffic. And originally, it was there to keep horse and carriages from crashing into valuable buildings. So they're protective barriers to divide things up.
Sure, but 200 years, okay?
Yeah,
Who would have thought?
at least.
Who would have thought?
Right.
We're separating pedestrians essentially from vehicular traffic.
Yes.
How is it that that's changed from then to now? And how is it that curbs today are serving the needs of cities?
Sure. So I think what's challenging today is that the curb, as it's been for 200 years, isn't meeting the needs that city government or residents have because of how much mobility is changing, right? The advent of shared services, of micromobility, of the need to use the road in different ways, from deliveries to more pedestrians who want to be able to walk to where they're going. And that little curb that we have between the sidewalk and the road just isn't enough to keep people safe, to maximize the access to the curb for people to get in and out or on and off of their vehicle, to deliver a package, to let buses stop and let people get on and off. So it's a mess out there, to be frank. But cities are really working hard with technology partners, et cetera, to do it differently, to do it better.
Okay. I've been to Nashville. We've talked about this before. Nashville, for anyone that hasn't been there, is a mess. No disregard to Nashville, but there's this micromobility craze of things like scooters, and they are everywhere. They're littering the streets. Some are sort of set up nicely, well managed. Some are just, it's carnage out there, and that's not an uncommon experience, isn't it? As we bring these new modes of transport into this sort of misunderstood infrastructure.
Well, and some of that's, I think, just the confusion of innovation, right? As new things come in, it takes time for the balance to reset itself. But one of the challenges that cities face that is, I think, starting to be solved is cities haven't had the tools to manage the curb or the real estate in the street any better than they have for 100 years. So, in the olden days, which is still true in most cities today, cities go out and they set up tow zones or loading zones or valet zones and bus stops, and those are static. And they permit them and they try to charge revenue for them and they try to manage that over time. And cities are incredibly dynamic places, right? We all know that. We live there. People move, the usage changes. But the management capabilities that cities have for the curb, either to parcel out that real estate, to change it over time, to keep people safe, et cetera, the management tools they've had are not dynamic. They've been entirely static. In fact, on any given day, in nearly any city in the world, if you walked in and asked them to give you a list of where all of their tow zones are, for example, very few cities could give you that list.
Sure, because you've got different functions, don't you? You've got the building function of issuing permits, the perhaps closed part of the street. You've got usage changes, etc. So this sets up a pretty interesting challenge from a location intelligence perspective.
Absolutely.
Dynamic environment where high value, high impact real estate. What is it that we've been doing from here in conjunction with our cities?
And Brendan set up the story very nicely. I think ultimately for us at Here Technologies, when we started to map our reality index, we were very focused on what we call the SD map, and it was just a center line of a street. We weren't even thinking about the curb. And that was fine for most of the transportation at the time, which is turn-by-turn instructions and getting a vehicle to a destination. But over the years, we started to build out HD maps, high-definition maps, and we were starting to collect things like lane attribution, lane width, and then getting to the actual curb. And so now we're starting to map the curb itself and define that in a way which we've never done before. The curb itself's been defined, the actual access points from the curb, so if you need to enter a building, etc. And what we're trying to do now is provide location-relevant data for the curb that allow for example, a ride-sharing company to actually arrive at the last meter as opposed to the last mile, so to speak. So we can really start to get granular about the origin and destination of where you're going to. That's one thing. I think the second thing too is collaboration. We talked a bit about the fact that there weren't the tools there to allow different, firstly, once you have a reference data set, different collaborators with different data sets to come together. And that's where the Here Marketplace and enabling different companies, if they can actually leverage and use the platform itself, and begin to build on top of that and collaborate around that. That's one of the key things as well.
Great. Now key to your company's name is collaborative. So obviously you're working with us. You're obviously working with the cities. Who are the sort of participants that need to be brought to the table when we're talking about implementing a curbside management system?
I think the project that we're doing together is a good example. Is you need the technology partners that are building the tools, you need the other data providers, and I think the user that's oftentimes most overlooked is the actual resident who's going to be experiencing a new kind of life in the city. So we work really hard in our projects to bring them to the table as well, to have that voice. And the project that we're working on, which has two steps, right? The first is the ability to create a dynamic, data-driven inventory of just what the city has at the curb. And then the ability to bring new value-driven operational models to that inventory so that you only need the bus stop to be a bus stop when the bus is there. And then when the bus moves on, you can free that up for other higher value usage than just being empty when the bus isn't there. So the partners include, right, the technology companies, the users of the curb, and most importantly, the resident who often don't have a voice in these projects.
Okay, and let's say there are companies out there that are looking to get involved, in the sort of collaborative efforts that you're working in. Sure. Where do they start? How do they sort of begin their journey? Whether they're a city that's trying to, address this challenge, or whether they're, somebody that's looking, that feels they've got some value add, or could benefit from the either the use of or the understanding and contribution to management of the curbside.
Yes, I mean, certainly I think they could come and talk to us. There's no shortage of partners that we need to solve these problems. And we're growing the collaborative group that we have working on last mile and congestion issues in cities all the time. So if there are either cities or companies or even nonprofit organizations that want to contribute to that, there's always room. We have more problems than we do solution creators right now. So there's always room for more.
Okay, let me ask you, problems, oftentimes I'm sure are driven by solutions. What's the best learning? What's your most sort of impactful learning that's come out of the efforts that you've been involved in?
Wow. I mean, honestly, and I know this is almost similar to what I said a minute ago, in any one of our solution projects, I mean, we've worked on almost 6 or 7 projects together in the last 3 years, is bringing together a collaborative group across, across the corporate world, the startup world, academia, nonprofit advocacy to really unpack whatever problem you're trying to solve. Because most people think, all of us do this, I do it, that we're city experts because we live there. Of course I know why congestion exists in Chicago. I live there. But if you bring together the experts that are trying to build solutions around that or that study it from an academic perspective, and you actually get them talking about the root cause of congestion in a collaborative way, what actually is causing that in small bite-sized pieces that you can address is very different than what any of us think day to day. So taking a very kind of practical and structured approach to innovation that comes from that collaborative problem-solving perspective where you hear multiple voices, that's been the strongest finding for us. It hasn't been this, there's no killer app that's going to fix cities. It's going to be a very practical approach to collaboration.
Fantastic. Now, talk to me a little bit about some of the sort of outcomes that have come out of that, some of the solutions, and also some of the sort of ingredient components that have really helped to impact the management of the curb.
So ingredient components, we often talk about congestion and what we can do to help solve those problems. We're all experiencing cities today. One of the services we're using are ride sharing, of course, and one of the most frustrating things is, in fact, when you're trying to match a rider and a driver together. And if a driver has to reroute a couple of times around a block to try to find you, and you're basically trying to walk down the street and all of a sudden go in the other direction, this is congestion for sure. Like if you think about, I think New York City at the moment, there's some studies who suggest that there's 50% during peak hours, 50% of the vehicles on the network there are either taxis or ride-sharing services. So what we can do is also to start to bring technologies like HD Wi-Fi and HD GNSS, which we launched at the show today. So more accurate positioning to really, even though you've got urban canyons which impact GPS signals, try to be able to get more accurate positioning to bring the driver and rider together, etc. So it's those kind of components, once they find their way into these solutions, will actually help as well.
Exactly. No, I think that sort of idea of sort of urban canyons and high performance positioning is really critical because you've got certainly constituents that perhaps don't have the same accessibility, and I think that that's an important aspect of both access and curb, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, accessibility and equity is critical in the technologies that cities are going to bring to bear. Because if everyone can't take advantage of the innovations that are coming, then the city itself isn't going to fully benefit. So it's important to think about how everybody is going to use it.
Great. I don't know, we've only got a minute or two left. Any final thoughts? Any sort of, what do you wish every city thought about when it came to the curb? And that could be the city, the city itself. That could be the inhabitants.
No, I think that it is that thought about partnership. The old model in cities of solving problems was really one-to-one, right? One partnership with one type of contractor or company or whomever to fix any kind of problem, whether you're talking about a technology solution or a construction solution. And that's really not going to be the case anymore. It's really going to be collaborative of solution development because the problems are so challenging and because the stakeholders are so diverse. That's a new way of working for cities, and I think a new way for their partners for working. So that's going to be what cities have to get used to.
I agree, totally agree. So certainly appreciate your partnership through this event and in terms of the work that we've been doing. For those that are looking to sort of perhaps understand a little bit more, some areas that may be particularly relevant. We've certainly got some conversations going on around last mile delivery, which is a key use of the curb. We also have technologies for reducing traffic and also seamless mobility. So at the back here we have 2 stations, one that talks really about the traffic and some of the work that, the benefits that mobility and the cities can provide, and one that talks about, for mobility service operators, capabilities to support those as well. So really appreciate the discussion. As I said, finishing on a high from my perspective, so really appreciate the efforts, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.